Hello everybody, this video builds upon the concept of the rule of return which we established in this video, which is quite simply the principle that you must return to soil what is taken from it. Traditionally, this was done with an organic cycle that goes soil, plant, animal before manure returns to the soil. Today we have synthetic fertiliser, which makes it linear, with fertiliser replacing the nutrients lost in the harvest, and the two can be combined. To the untrained naked eye, this is what happens on farms. They use manure or fertiliser or both. Some people pointed out in the comments on that video, these little diagrams don't explain all functions of soil. Surely the manure has less stuff in it than the plant, so this cycle isn't a completely closed loop and will eventually exhaust the soil. Today we will answer one little part of that question. This is, if you like, the agricultural cycle, but within this are lots of other cycles, which is what makes farming interesting and distinguishes it from other industries. You have the water cycle, which we've already discussed, the carbon cycle, and all of the mineral cycles like iron and magnesium, but most importantly potassium, phosphorus and nitrogen. And on a more abstract level, you have the life cycle and the changing of the seasons. This is why farming is so interesting. It's all about circles, and circles are very visually pleasing. Today we'll just be looking at one of these little cycles, the most important one perhaps, the nitrogen cycle, and how it was redesigned by this man to allow human civilization to exist on an industrial scale. Plants need lots of different things to grow. They need water and sunlight and lots of different nutrients, and if they're missing one of these essential things, it will stunt their growth and become a limiting factor. If you imagine each required nutrient as a plank of a barrel, the barrel will only fill to the level of the lowest plank. And in this way, a plant will only grow as far as its limiting factor will allow. Nitrogen is a very common limiting factor. Plants need it for lots of stuff. It helps them photosynthesize, create amino acids for proteins, build DNA, cell growth. Helpfully, the atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, about 78%. But unhelpfully, all of the little nitrogen particles are attached to each other and they're really stable, and in a form that most plants can't use. So to make the atmospheric nitrogen useful to plants, they have to be split apart, and there are ways that this can happen naturally. On a diagram, the nitrogen cycle looks really complicated, but there's only a few ways that nitrogen can be fixed from the atmosphere into a form that plants can use. Lightning strikes contain enough energy to split them apart. Leguminous plants like clover, peas and beans have root nodules that provide a habitat for bacteria that can fix nitrogen. This makes ammonia, after which more bacteria, nitrifying bacteria, add oxygen and convert the ammonia into nitrite, which is nitrogen and 2 oxygens, or nitrate, which is nitrogen and 3 oxygens, and then the plants can take it up. Animal manure also releases ammonia when broken down, which is converted into nitrate and nitrite by the bacteria in the soil. This is why the organic cycle works. It's not completely watertight, some energy and nutrients are lost, but the manure returns nitrogen to the soil, which is generally the limiting factor in plant growth. Alongside these processes, you also get denitrifying bacteria, who are the bad guys. They take accessible nitrogen out of the soil and return it into the atmosphere. People in the past didn't know that nitrogen existed, but they had some understanding of the effects of the nitrogen cycle. They understood that soil could be exhausted, and a lot of early cultures would just move from plot to plot to avoid that. People figured out that manure restored fertility. Medieval peasants would bring their animals off pasture at night onto cropland so they would manure it a little bit, which seems like a lot of work for little reward, but that's how important nitrogen is. This is why the Norfolk four-course rotation introduced in the agricultural revolution included clover, a legume, and why guano and Chilean nitrate of soda was so valuable as a fertiliser that we shipped it here all the way from South America. But these methods had disadvantages. Animal manure was only between 2 and 4% nitrogen, and guano and other mined resources would run out. Even by the turn of the 20th century, crop yields were really low by modern standards. With average crop yields remaining at the 1900 level, the crop harvest in the year 2000 would have required nearly 4 times more land, and the cultivated area would have claimed nearly half of all ice-free continents, rather than the under 15% of the total land area that is required today. But populations were growing, so scientists started looking at the problem of fertiliser. In the early 1840s, a German chap called Justus von Liebig debunked humus theory, which believed the carbon in plants came from the dead plant matter in the humus layer of the soil, and fertilisers help break down the dead matter and allow plants to absorb it. They figure out that plant nutrition can be seen in strictly chemical terms. There's no whimsy or magical ingredient of life hidden within the humus. Plants take carbon from the air, and hydrogen from the water, and nitrogen from the soil. The plants can't tell if the nitrogen is organic in humus or inorganic and synthetically produced. The value of a fertiliser lay in what it contained, and that meant you could design and manufacture it. In 1843, about the same time, the Rothamsted Research Station was founded by John Laws on his estate to investigate the potential for inorganic fertiliser and to compare them to traditional manures. With the help of Joseph Gilbert, he started producing superphosphate for sale, making mineral phosphate soluble by mixing it with sulfuric acid. Man-made fertilisers were known to work and became widespread. Other mineral phosphates, nitrate of soda from Chile, potash manures from Germany, sulfate of ammonia from the gasworks, basic slag from the steelworks, and finally synthetic nitrogen compounds from the air came into general use on the farm. Getting nitrogen from the air wasn't as easy as mining minerals or using the byproducts of industrial processes, but they knew it was abundant. If someone could work out how to fix it into a useful form, the problem of fertiliser would be solved. You could make bread from air. In 1905, German scientist Franklin Caro worked out how to make calcium cyanide, which is a carbon and two nitrogens, but this was very labour and energy intensive. At the same time, Norwegians Christian Birkeland and Samuel Eide invented a process that used electrical arcs to split the nitrogen and create nitric acid, which could in turn produce nitrate. But this also used a lot of power. Then another German, a man called Fritz Haber, worked out an economically viable way to produce ammonia by mixing the nitrogen with hydrogen under a lot of heat and pressure with an iron catalyst. This still used a lot of power, but the amount needed was greatly reduced, and the iron catalyst was very cheap. This is the Haber process and was industrialised with the help of Carl Bosch. All the scientists were in pairs for some reason. At this point, I would like to introduce a graph of the human population. There is a lot of stuff going on here, but these people needed food, which I suppose is the limiting factor of human population growth. Stuff like plant breeding, mechanisation had been going on for a long time, but the big jump comes from nitrogen. Fritz Haber, his bread from air, nitrogen fertiliser fixes the key constraint in agriculture and the human population explodes. As you can probably tell from the graph, this happens on a very impressive scale. Through Haber's process, people today produce roughly the same amount of reactive nitrogen as natural processes do. This is a massive operation. Haber's process is also used in the manufacture of explosives which require nitrate. Like explosives, agricultural fertiliser has a lot of energy in it and it's incredibly dangerous. Initially, artificial fertiliser came as a powder that would just be dropped onto the land, like this chap's having to do with his legs. It would be a faster job if you could just throw it evenly and consistently across the field, which is what this machine is for. Modern fertiliser spreaders are quite simple machines really, they're just hoppers that you put the fertiliser in. This one has a lifting arm on it so it can load itself, which you don't see very often anymore. Beneath the hopper there's two spinning discs that fling the fertiliser across the field when they hit it. And on the bottom of the hopper there's some controls so you can calibrate the flow of fertiliser out of the spreader to the desired rate. The machine this thing is attached to looks like an absolute beast, but it's not actually a very big tractor, it's just fitted with flotation tyres. I know people like to moan about farmers contributing to climate change, but we're also getting absolutely screwed by it. It hasn't stopped raining this year, so it's been really difficult to get onto the fields without sinking or just churning it up and destroying our soil structure. So in this case the problem has been dealt with by fitting a relatively lightweight tractor with some really wide tyres to spread the weight and stop it sinking. Today the fertiliser itself comes in these big bags, so you have to load it by machine. Often now people put the fert bags on trailers and take the trailer to the field so you don't have to go back to the yard every time you need to refill the spreader. I was being very careful moving the bags, I'm always worried they might split, but the other road users seem sympathetic enough. The fertiliser comes in even white balls called prills, which you release just by cutting the bag and letting them fall into the spreader. The bags are single use, but they are recyclable. When spreading, the prills mean the fertiliser is broadcast very evenly and tractors will generally be guided either by GPS or by tram lines already marked in the field, so there shouldn't really be any overlap. I was very impressed with the flotation tyres on this thing. I don't think you can tell just how wet it was, but it didn't sink at all. The principle of this job is the same everywhere, I think. This is some fertiliser being spread on the wheat on our farm now that it's dried up a bit. And when you finish the load, you scoot back and get filled up again. But in this modern age, fertiliser is very controversial. Most of the books you'll find in shops about farming at the moment promote organic farming or have some organic leaning idea, and this is because they think fertiliser is bad for the environment. But the amount of land farmed organically in the UK is incredibly small. 2.9% last year, according to the government. There are a lot of armchair farmers in this world, but the actual farmers, the people who live on the land, who still have their traditional relationship with nature, the professionals, don't agree that organic farming is a very good idea because they don't do it. And if it did work, they would do it, because fertiliser is really expensive. We did get a brief glimpse of what the UK might look like without fertiliser when during COVID our fertiliser plants shut down in response to high natural gas prices. After which our population discovered that fertiliser plants also produce CO2 and started panicking because without the carbon from the fertiliser plants they wouldn't be able to have fresh packets of crisps or fizzy drinks. Meanwhile, in the farming community we were panicking because there was a much bigger problem in that we might run out of food. The government stepped in to pay the plants costs for a while because of the CO2 problem, but fertiliser prices went through the roof. A tonne of imported fertiliser in February 2020 was £185 and by autumn 2022 it was £870. I compare imports because there was no domestic price listed when the indexes peaked because we weren't producing any. After that, food inflation was much higher than the general inflation, and although stable now, prices are still a lot higher than they were when all that happened, so it has had a lasting effect on consumers. The government has revised agricultural subsidies to encourage people to farm organically with the sustainable farming incentive, but not many people have been signing up for that, which I think is pretty punk really. These people have no voice on the public stage, but I am one of them, and today I will be arguing on the behalf of the farmers who look after 97% of our farmed land that fertilisers are necessary. The most important point here is that we would not be able to support our post-industrial population size without it. This is accepted. To take it from a scientist, Vaclav Smil, who writes, I think, uniquely well thought out books about food systems and has been described by a climate scientist as a slayer of bullshit. He says, global agriculture has become steadily more dependent on synthetic nitrogenous compounds, without whose applications we would not be able to produce roughly half of today's world food. It is that simple. Statistically, the Haber process is very possibly the reason you are able to exist. It seems very strange to me that it is socially acceptable to argue for a food policy that would, in one way or another, mean starving half of all people. Farmers use fertiliser to keep the city people alive. We don't do it for us. We could feed ourselves with organic agriculture. There's only 500,000 of us now. But then it's also the city people that moan at us for using fertiliser, which is quite mean-spirited, I think. Sometimes people ignore or deny the fact that organic farming would involve starving people, or come up with some new idea to circumnavigate the need for farming entirely, like growing food in vats or food forests, which I get comments about sometimes. This idea is that it's like a rainforest, but you can eat everything in it, which in the UK would be a very efficient way to grow a lot of blackberries and not much else. These ideas will be discussed in detail on their merits, but again, I think it's a bit mean-spirited. We use fertiliser to keep everybody alive, and then city people respond negatively to this and design a food system and countryside that doesn't have country people in it. Rewilding is a very explicit example of this. Because of fertiliser almost, the fundamental of scientific farming, we are not wanted anymore. Even the government is telling us to transition and diversify our businesses away from farming. We're not made to feel welcome in our own landscape. I've gone off topic a bit here, but I think the dissonance between town and country is important because it frames the debate around fertiliser. Farmers think that fertiliser is necessary because without it, in one way or another, people will starve. Whereas city people who write books about it have environmental concerns. Just to really emphasise how impractical abandoning fertiliser would be, we're going to take a visit to Sri Lanka, where in the spring of 2021, President Rajapaksa gave in to the voices and banned fertiliser cold turkey. And this was despite warnings from scientists and agricultural advisors who said that that would cause a decrease in yields for various crops between 25 and 100%. 70% of Sri Lanka's exports had been agricultural, and a lot of it was tea, the production of which was crippled by the fertiliser ban. The government then had to start importing rice to stop people starving, which was more expensive than the fertiliser had been. So in this case, the effects of organic agriculture were a depletion of their foreign currency reserves, economic collapse, a great deal of human suffering, and the president had to flee the country. I got a comment a while back saying that Cuba do organic agriculture very well, which surprised me. I don't know very much about agriculture in Cuba, but I knew their dictator Fidel Castro was very keen on scientific farming and bred a super cow called Ubre Blanca, who once produced 109.5 litres of milk in a single day, which is a lot of milk. So I looked it up, and the Cubans used to receive fertiliser from the Soviet Union, but the Soviets stopped sending it in the mid-90s for some reason, and since then Cuba has struggled with food shortages. This is a very interesting thing to look up because there's lots of articles saying that what Cuba's doing is great, but then also lots of articles saying that they're begging the UN for help. There seems to be a desire to portray organic agriculture as something that is good even while it's causing human suffering. Very strange. This is because fertiliser is seen to be bad for the environment, which is something we must put into perspective. Why is climate change bad? Of course, it is a shame to destroy the planet and affect all of the living things on it that don't deserve that, but most immediately climate change is a threat to us because it will inhibit our ability to support our own population. So attacking fertiliser as the one thing that underpins the global food supply is failing to see the bigger picture, I think. The Haber process uses a lot of energy, which causes carbon emissions. It could be done renewably with electricity, but as it stands, the Haber-Bosch process is currently one of the largest global energy consumers and greenhouse gas emitters, responsible for 1.2% of the global anthropogenic CO2 emissions. This is a problem, a very real disadvantage, but we can't stop the process. We have to redesign how it is done so we can make bread from air renewably. Perhaps replacing the CO2-intensive methane-fed process with hydrogen produced by water splitting using renewable electricity, which this article thinks is not outside the realm of possibility. Despite the technical feasibility of the electrically driven Haber-Bosch ammonia, the question still remains whether such a revolution will take place. Hopefully some scientists can sort that out. But on the agricultural side of things, we should promote efficiency of use. But this is something there's an economic incentive for. Farmers don't want to waste fertiliser, it's very expensive. They want to use it as precisely as possible. Farmers will send soil samples off for analysis. It gets tested for nutrients, so then they will only buy and apply the fertilisers that they need for the relevant plant nutrition. Efficiency of applied fertiliser does vary based on practice and climate and soil structure, and inevitably some is lost to the atmosphere via denitrifying bacteria. But this is something that farmers can and are trying to get right. Fertiliser encourages plant growth, and plants absorb CO2, so there must surely be some offset inherent in the application of fertiliser, but I can't find any good science on it. So if anyone has any pointers, they would be more than welcome. Some people say that organic produce is more nutritious, but there's no reason for that. If the plant nutrition is correct, the plant nutrition is correct. Plants have no conception of the philosophy of organic food, they just want nitrate. And that has the same chemical structure no matter where it comes from. There's always lots of criticism in the media about fertiliser runoff and eutrophication, where nitrate gets into water and causes an algal bloom, which blocks out the sun and kills everything. This is a very real problem, but I do think it's at least a little bit overstated. A lot of the nitrate in our rivers comes from water companies who deliberately pump them full of human sewage for economic gain. Farmers, meanwhile, have an economic incentive to keep nitrate out of rivers. They don't want to pay for runoff, so they keep a close eye on the weather forecasts and they're very careful when they apply it. And the scientists that design fertilisers don't want the nitrogen to be released to anything but the plant. Prills help prevent loss to the atmosphere in dry periods before the nitrogen can be absorbed into the soil. And prills can contain nitrate rather than ammonia that would need to be converted in the soil by bacteria, so they're a very quick releasing form of crop nutrition. This helps the plants take up the nitrogen before it can be released back into the atmosphere. So technology is already helping with these problems, and it's all very heavily regulated. There's rules you have to follow for the application of fertiliser, the spreading of manure and the spreading of slurry that increasingly require stuff like precision equipment rather than splash plates. And they control when you can spread stuff too. We are talking about fertilisers here, but I think organic is a very unhelpful category that we should abandon. Fertilisers are a very thorny issue because they do have very real disadvantages, but it's a completely different issue to sprays, which are also outlawed by organic doctrine. Sprays in a lot of instances help combat climate change because they save fuel. Spraying a crop off with herbicide before planting a new one with a no-till system doesn't use very much fuel at all. A sprayer covers a very wide area really fast and doesn't tax the engine. But ploughing, which is the organic way to turn a field around, is very slow, it's a heavy job, and it burns a lot more fossil fuels. Organic was never an idea that was intended to fight climate change. The Soil Association, who promote it in Britain, was founded in 1946, which was long before our current conception of climate change emerged. They're not people who have looked at the problem of climate change critically and decided that organic farming is the best thing to do. They wanted organic farming long before that for different reasons. As such, the approach of this channel to organic farming is as follows. We should maximise organic methods, but only insofar as they can maintain the population and reduce emissions. But if you followed this principle, I don't think you'd be organic very often at all. You'd just try to be as efficient as possible. Now, with regret, I must interrupt the programme to share with you this week's joke, which is, how do you know if somebody went to Oxford University? They'll tell you. To finish off, I wanted to talk through an example of an argument in favour of organic agriculture, written by perhaps the only authentic working family farmer on the public stage, Britain's rock star shepherd and organic farming advocate, James Rebanks. Me and Mr. Rebanks have a lot in common. We both come from proper working countryside farming families. Both of our fathers were dairy farmers who had a strong sense of civic duty and felt that there was great social utility in cheap, nutritious food. But both of them ended up giving up because of the ridiculous pressures that everyone puts on dairy farmers. We both went to Oxford University, we both studied history, we both got firsts, and after that we both mess around with rare breed sheep corresponding to our respective counties in the British Midlands. I haven't shown you my sheep yet, but we have more important stuff to talk about. Our life stories are the same, really. The countryside and the food system are in such an awful state at the moment, and he is the only person from my social background, that of genuine country working people, that anybody ever listens to. You can imagine my disappointment. He writes in a book intended to be some sort of organic manifesto. Some estimates have put the number of humans that could be fed without Haber-Bosch farming techniques at 4 billion, which would mean, if true, that more than 3 billion humans today are only alive thanks to Haber and Bosch. If true. It is true, and he knows that it is true, but he is suggesting here, without evidence, that it might not be, because he's got to lay the groundwork for something very silly that he says next. But Haber's legacy was far from simple or benign. Ammonium nitrate was meant to help feed people, but it was first used as an explosive in the most murderous wars in human history. Haber's other legacy was his contribution to the development of poisonous chlorine gas for use in the trenches of the First World War, and the pesticide gas Zyklon B, later used in Nazi death camps to kill millions of people. Isn't that strange? Why has he included this in his book? Here, Rebanks is trying to conceptually link fertiliser use to the Holocaust. The implication being that the Holocaust was an unspeakably bad thing. So, by association, somehow, through the character of Fritz Haber, modern fertiliser use must also be bad. The character of Fritz Haber is not relevant to modern fertiliser production because he died in 1934. Rebanks studied history. He got a first at Oxford, but a cursory glance of Wikipedia would reveal that that was a very insensitive thing to have written. You see, Fritz Haber was a Jew, but more than that, for his ancestry, Fritz Haber was personally targeted by the Nazis, despite having converted to Christianity. In the early 1930s, he was the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and was ordered to get rid of all of the Jewish personnel beneath him. But he used his position to manage the situation in such a way that all of his Jewish subordinates would have somewhere to escape to before he himself resigned and fled the country. And again, he died in 1934. I don't think it's reasonable to blame him in any way for the Holocaust. He used his position to help Jewish people escape. Mr. Rebanks is an educated man with relevant experience, and this is what he comes out with. A smear that isn't historically accurate, and even if it was, the logic would still be unsound. What's important isn't the character of Haber, but the process that he discovered. I mean, I think Mr. Rebanks should apologise to the farming community for suggesting that somehow, by implication, something that we do to keep everybody alive is linked to the Holocaust, and I think he should also apologise to the Jewish community for suggesting that Nazi death camps were the legacy of a Jewish man. There is also a much greater irony to this, in that the Nazis loved organic agriculture, which is something I'm sure Mr. Rebanks is well aware of. He goes on to admit that his vision for organic farming just won't work. We won't win any prizes for our farming or make a lot of money from it, and it won't feed the world. So he says this, but still thinks that it's a good thing. Who is it for? It doesn't feed our fellow working class citizens in the cities. It doesn't make him a good living. Perhaps it's for his animals. But the ideology that leads him to say these things also causes him to neglect his animals, who suffer from hunger and die from preventable diseases like liver fluke, which is a parasitic disease in sheep. Our new farming life means we have less power and control. When the long winter put my sheep under severe pressure, when they were lean and tired, they began to struggle. Pneumonia set in, and several became ill and died. I knew that if we had treated them with one of the powerful drugs for killing flukes, we might have avoided this. Is this not abuse? Do you not have a duty of care? I think the lesson here is that we must be reasonable. It's not possible to argue that synthetic fertiliser has no disadvantages, but at the same time, when the powerful and worldly mind of James Rebanks is applied to the organic cause, it doesn't produce a strong argument. What we need here is pragmatism, and to do the best thing to reduce emissions while feeding everyone. You can't use pre-industrial farming techniques to feed a post-industrial population. It just can't happen. I know advancements have been made in organic technologies like plant breeding, but they're not enough. They allow this, but not this. We need fertiliser. It is a shame that we're reliant on it, but that doesn't change the fact that we are. And also, when organic farming supported an organic population in the medieval times, we didn't ship produce far from the land and flush it into the oceans in the form of sewage, which today forms a considerable drain of nutrients. Organic farming could only ever really work with a small population of peasants. Rebanks finishes his book with a quote: "Tell them what is happening on the land. Someone has to tell them." I will. It starts next week. Don't miss it.